Respawn Entertainment. I'm actually a big fan. These guys are made up of the past members of Infinity Ward, the same Infinity Ward that created the Modern Warfare trilogy, which was Call of Duty's peak in terms of interest. It was so big that ever since, Call of Duty has constantly tried to recapture that series, even by rebooting it because new ideas are far too hard to come up with. In other words, Respawn are responsible for creating the Call of Duty formula and making modern military games popular, which wasn't actually a good thing because the amount of lazy shooters that came out afterwards was a lot. But anyway, what made the Modern Warfare series so beloved, and I guess the whole franchise in general, was all it did was aim to put you in the shoes of an SAS soldier. There were no dumb characters or over-the-top scripted sequences. The missions people remember the most, in fact, were the slow stealth ones. This is something the newer Call of Duties don't understand, as they basically just evolved into "We had orders!" and they horribly miscast actors. So, Respawn, after creating the greatest selling franchise of all time, watched one episode of Mobile Suit Gundam and said, "Let's do that!" And so Titanfall was born, and to be honest, it was pretty good. Despite balancing and progression issues, it's definitely the closest anyone's ever come to evolving the Call of Duty formula, and you can definitely tell these were the guys behind Modern Warfare. In 2016, Respawn said, "Alright, you motherfuckers will fix the game and we'll give you a single player campaign." And so Titanfall 2 was born, and it was great. The single player was incredibly solid and is one of the best first-person shooter campaigns to come out in recent memory, and the multiplayer was a big improvement. But none of that mattered because EA decided to release it right next to another massively multiplayer shooter called Battlefield 1, which is made by the same company. So nobody bought it. You all bought Battlefield 1 instead, which is significantly worse, once again proving why we can't have nice things, because you f***s don't support a good video game when it comes out! Oh no, we'd all rather buy Anthem and then be baffled about why it's bad when anybody with 2 brain cells saw it coming a mile away. That's it, I quit. Wait, is that a dual lightsaber? I know what those are!
And now presenting your host for the evening, the one and only Demonpickle.
Man, I've got to stop drinking this stuff, it's gonna kill me. Respawn earlier this year released Apex Legends, once again proving that they actually evolve stuff and don't just release the same thing a billion times. They're also the only company owned by EA that actually have some leverage over them. I don't know if whatever deal they signed allows them to tell EA to f*** off, but they're the only ones who can create whatever they want and not have it be a completely butchered multiplayer live service game. But you don't care about any of that. All you care about is, does Star Wars Jedi Fallen franchise make you feel like a Jedi? Make you feel like a Jedi. Really feel like a Jedi. Make you feel like your bones. We are one with the Force. Make you feel like a Jedi. Feel like a Jedi. This is Gold Leader. We're heading for the target shaft now. I have a bad feeling about this. This is where the fun begins. What's those wrist rockets? Well, does it? No. It makes you feel more like a Padawan instead. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, this is still the best Star Wars related thing we've received in the last 10 years. Although the bar is pretty low. Really, this game is one of the more boring ones to review because Fallen Order's really good at a lot of things, but it's not really great at anything. I don't know how it took EA this long to realize all I want to do is swing a f***ing lightsaber. I don't want to grind for 40 hours just to unlock Darth Vader. One thing that's always been consistent in EA's Star Wars games, and it's probably the only thing they've gotten right this far, is this does capture Star Wars incredibly well. Pulling out that lightsaber is as satisfying as you'd think it'd be. Running into battle and hearing that just fills you with this excitement. It's probably what Anakin felt like when he killed all those younglings. Fallen Order is not running off of the Frostbite engine or has the master craftsmanship of DICE's graphics department, so it doesn't look great, but there are definitely standout moments. Despite not being as pretty as the Battlefront games, it doesn't mean they haven't done a great job with the art direction. Each planet offers its own distinct look, and all of them look like they've been taken straight from one of the movies. The multiple Empire bases have that same clean chrome hallway design from the Death Star, full of robotics and blinking lights. Even places such as the dense jungles on planets such as Kashyyyk all have such great amounts of attention put into them. Basically what I'm trying to say is that there isn't one corner of this game that feels out of place. It feels like Star Wars. The sound design and lighting is all very well done. I love the sound of the blaster fire and the way your lightsaber illuminates a room. And of course the music, well, it's pretty much cheating because it's a recreation of John Williams' score, but that's never a bad thing. There's always been something magical about Star Wars' soundtrack. That overly epic orchestral sound is partly what makes those original movies so good. It might be the only thing the prequels did right. Most of the monster designs here are good, some are a little odd, but the character models are really what I have a problem with. Facial capture here isn't excellent. The stormtroopers all look like stormtroopers and most of the models are fine, but I'm not sure how they thought Bug Lady over here was okay. Oh my god, what happened to your face? Oh no, Cal! We found the Bug Queen! Kill it! While the level design is great for the most part, it does one thing that you should always be careful of doing, which is breaking immersion. Despite visually recapturing Star Wars terrifically, a lot of the time it doesn't matter that much when your levels are so obvious. Now Respawn have made a bold, daring move in deciding that Fallen Order is not going to be an open world game. Yeah, like, we're really breaking down barriers over here. This game gets a lot of comparisons to Dark Souls, which is fair, and I'm gonna end up doing it as well, but this game is much more like the new God of War, so I'm gonna break this down real quick.
Break it down for me.
God of War's level design is fantastic. Despite most of the levels being nothing but a bunch of connected corridors, they still found a way to create that Metroidvania-like exploration and do it well. But what really adds to it is that for almost all of it, it never feels like an obvious video game level, like the developers just placed a bunch of stuff everywhere. Because of this, God of War's world always feels real and it never breaks immersion, which is also the reason the whole game is one shot. The issue with Star Wars is that it very rarely feels like an actual place, thanks to obviously placed things like ropes and slides. Sure, it looks like Star Wars, but it never feels like it's real. You're always reminded it's a video game level. It reminds me a lot of games that were on the Xbox One. I'm sorry, the original Xbox. Great naming there, Microsoft. What's the next one gonna be called? Xbox Zero? Sales, because no one's gonna buy the next one. Like I said, the level design here isn't bad, it's that the game doesn't handle immersion very well, and a little subtlety would go a long way. Alright, you know what, I'm bored now, let's talk about Dark Souls. Isn't Dark Souls just fantastic? All the areas and the enemies are just so well done.
Are you talking about Dark Souls again?
Oh shit. Fallen Order isn't really a Souls-like though, it's much more like something such as God of War where only the combat takes inspiration. But of course there's a big difference between taking inspiration and copying something. If you copy something it's most likely just going to feel worse than what it's imitating, so you should always avoid it. Thankfully Star Wars has adapted it pretty damn well. The reason I say you're more like a Padawan is because, well, you are, and the combat isn't focused around being a badass Jedi. Only towards the end, once you've unlocked all your powers, do you really start to live out that Jedi power fantasy, although it's nothing like the Force Unleashed.
Reach out with the Force and grab that destroyer!
Shut up! So for a majority of the game, instead of feeling like this, you mostly feel like just a guy with a lightsaber, and to be honest, I'm okay with that. Obviously this is going to be a series thanks to the 2 dots after Jedi, and if they want to tell a story about how this character eventually becomes a Jedi of legend, then this isn't a bad way to do it. So the way Souls combat works is you, as the player, don't really have many methods of attack. Really, the entire combat system is based off the enemy design. It's also really f***ing hard to do. If the enemy design is bad, it basically kills the entire gameplay side of your game. And I'm glad to say, Fallen Order has one of the most solid grasps on this I've seen. Don't get me wrong, it ain't Dark Souls. In fact, for a lot of this game, all it did was make me want to play Sekiro again, but that's not to say it's not a good time. Your lightsaber in this game works exactly as you'd expect. You can swing, block, deflect bullets, throw it, dismember. Oh wait, no you can't, because Disney are a bunch of babies who think a series full of violence, hatred, drinking, smoking, mass murder is for children. Yeah, marketable fascism! Come on, Disney! Take over my country next! The real reason is that Disney think dismemberment in the Star Wars universe should only be used for important plot points, which I think further proves that Star Wars shouldn't be a cinematic universe because the universe is boring. And even though it's not Respawn's fault, I still have to consider this a negative because it makes a lot of the fights in Fallen Order feel fake. There are plenty of execution moves that clearly should cut limbs off, but instead just leaves a lame mark on them. The combat could have been so much more satisfying if you could slice stormtroopers in half, especially since one aspect of it that's great is that the enemies communicate. Stormtroopers will say things based on what they see, such as if you double jump they'll say something like, "Wow, he can jump really high," and if there's only one of them left, they'll start panicking. So it would have been great to cut an enemy's arm off and hear them scream, "Oh god, my arm!" or "It burns!" or "Epstein did kill himself!" Despite this though, this doesn't ruin the combat and enemy design, which is pretty well done. Dodging and weaving around enemies and waiting for your time to strike is key, that along with blocking and parrying attacks. There was a lot of satisfaction when you block at the right time and parry an opponent, leaving them open for devastating attacks. Even more so when you're on the brink of death. Those moments are where Fallen Order shines, but what appears to be a fairly normal combat system is actually quite an intelligent one. There is no stealth in Fallen Order, which I think could have been pretty cool, but I guess it does make sense since the Jedi aren't exactly known for being sneaky.
Hello there.
Open fire!
One of the things I love about the enemy design is that Respawn have realized the majority of the enemies shouldn't have lots of health because you don't want fights to drag on. Not only this, but they've understood enemy variety is incredibly important. There are a large amount of different enemy types that really help the later stages of the game not get stale. Combining these two things together works wonderfully. A normal range trooper is absolutely no threat on their own, but combine that with a couple more, along with some melee enemies, and suddenly they become your worst nightmare. This is plain and simple good game design. Mixing and matching all these enemy types together creates different kinds of encounters, meaning you don't ever not have to think about fights, making the whole experience that much more engaging. And this of course is helped by the game's balancing. Playing games like this on their hardest difficulty always helps you understand just how well they're designed, and Fallen Order is no exception. This is why I suggest if you're playing on anything that isn't Jedi Grandmaster or Jedi Master, you're playing it wrong. Not being challenged requires you to not think, and that's never a good thing in these types of games. The cool thing about Fallen Order's difficulty options though is that they don't just make it so you die immediately, they actually affect things like enemy aggression and parry timing. I've seen people say this is Souls hard, but after beating it on Grandmaster and beating Sekiro, it's not even close. Doesn't matter anyway though, since there are no difficulty related achievements. Like, what's the point then? You might as well just give people the platinum for starting the game. Also, why isn't this difficulty called Padawan? It shouldn't be called Storyteller, it should be called I want the game to play itself because I don't really like playing video games. Call them out for what they are, you know? How dare people play games differently from the way I play them. But seriously, don't play it on the easiest. No, that's not to say the combat is perfect. This entire game kind of just reminds me of a worse God of War, which is kind of weird because the game director of this game directed God of War 3, which I guess is just a worse God of War 2, and that game was directed by the guy who made the new God of War. Okay, now I'm confused. Why don't you two just team up and make the best God of War ever? What's this got to do with Star Wars? What am I talking about? The humanoid fights in Fallen Order are certainly the strongest. Most of the boss fights in particular are really great, but the game slips up when it comes to the monsters. Fights in Dark Souls are excellent because each enemy is incredibly varied, they all behave differently. Sure, you still just dodge, block and swing, but thanks to the enemy design, you need to know when and where to dodge, block and swing. If a dude is swinging horizontally, rolling forward or backward is probably a bad idea. Each enemy has its own timings and telegraph their attacks differently. Now in defense of Star Wars, pretty much every game gets this wrong. As I said, this combat system is extremely hard to get right. A lot of the monsters in Fallen Order require the exact same strategy. You roll to the side and swing. The enemy doesn't encourage you to roll in a certain direction, because if you can just roll right and it works every time, you're not going to change your strategy. This makes the player think less, and thinking less is bad because it makes the combat less engaging. Adding force powers into the mix helps this, but it's still an issue. The game also suffers a bit from what God of War suffered from, which is when fighting multiple melee enemies, a lot of the challenge is making sure you can attack an enemy without being hit in the back. Not to say this doesn't still work, but it's not anywhere near as exciting as actually dodging the enemy you're fighting, which is why the one-on-one fights are the best fights. Let me re-emphasize that I think the enemy design and the combat in Fallen Order overall is very good, better than most games that attempt this, but I've seen it done better and I know the enemy design can be tighter. Just as an extra note, due to how short your lightsaber is, closing the distance with a ranged enemy is annoying, as well as them being able to shoot faster than you can swing, making it so you are better off just deflecting. Also, the AI can't climb and it's funny. When the demo of Fallen Order was shown at E3, there was a lot of confusion of what it actually was. It looked like a blend between a Souls-like and Uncharted, but it didn't feel fully committed to either, and that's how the game turned out. The best way to sum up this game is that it's basically God of War but worse, like I said, so let's break it down again.
Break it down for me.
I didn't love God of War 2018 as much as everyone else, but that doesn't mean I don't think it's a great game. God of War was a semi-open world action-adventure game that felt like it had a strong vision behind it and knew exactly what it wanted to be. It was able to create a fairly linear RPG with a lot of emphasis on exploration with its Metroidvania-like design. It found a way to naturally introduce these large areas to you through its story, while at the same time allowing you to go off and explore. It was perfectly paced, side stuff felt like it blended in with the whole adventure rather than being side stuff, while having excellent set pieces and memorable levels a linear game would have. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order feels like it dumps you on a planet and says, I don't know, explore I guess. Because there's no real commitment, both the Metroidvania and the linear adventure parts of the game feel quite tame. Look, they've done a good job for the most part, but it's not great. Now you may have heard me say this once or twice, but exploration is the most engaging thing you could do in a video game. If you get your player to go out of their way to do something they weren't told about and they feel rewarded for it, you've got them. Fallen Order of course is a bit Metroidvania, so if you want, you can backtrack to an area you may not have been able to access before and go explore it. You could find chests, Estus shot, stim canisters, that sort of thing. It even has the health upgrade system from God of War. Now the game does a good job with this. Exploration works in areas you haven't been to before that are now accessible or marked on your map. Going back to the first planet and finding a stim canister is a big deal and feels damn rewarding. But this only happens like 20% of the time because the other 80% is just chests. What's in the chests, you ask? Cosmetics that don't add anything to the game. Once I got my pink poncho, I knew I didn't want anything else. You can customize your lightsaber with the parts you find, but you can barely see it anyway. I'm not f***ing General Grievous, I don't care about cosmetics. Pretty much all the cosmetics here are garbage, which sucks considering you have access to the Star Wars universe where you can pull thousands of different costumes out of it. The problem with all of this is that there's no way to discern if an area you haven't been to yet has something useful or something cosmetic. That mixed with the fact that there's no fast travel, so you have to run all the way back, making exploring a f***ing chore that might not have any reward. Thankfully, the shortcuts and level design is smartly laid out, so getting back somewhere isn't an issue, but because it's not worth it most of the time, I just stopped exploring. It's weird because I don't think the exploration here is done badly. It's not super smart, but it's good enough, so why is it mostly useless? The actual upgrades you obtain are either through progressing through the story or through the skill tree. And as someone who is sick and tired of poorly implemented skill trees, Fallen Order has a really great one. Experience of Fallen Order is obtained much like in Sekiro, where you kill enemies and eventually get a skill point. If you die, you have to go back and strike the enemy that killed you in order to regain it. Almost every skill here is useful. There was never a time where I didn't want anything, which is always what you want with a skill tree. Upgrades such as throwing your lightsaber and making your force power stronger are all really useful, which is something you don't see very often. So considering all of this, why isn't this game linear? If your exploration has barely anything to offer me, what's the point? Why sacrifice a possibly great linear game for exploration that doesn't add anything? Thanks to this, the other parts of the game suffer. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is a good adventure game, but it's no Uncharted 2. Uncharted 2 is epic. It's fantastic all the way through and is possibly the best sequel to a game ever made. Fallen Order gets a lot of comparisons to this series because it has climbing and puzzle solving, and it has this because it's a great way to break up the gameplay. But how you use these things is very important. Climbing is only good in these games if what you're climbing is visually interesting or very tense. It's the reason lots of people have a problem with the climbing in Uncharted 4. Fallen Order doesn't use climbing very well. It mostly consists of slopes, wall running, and simply scaling things. Whoa, Jesus! Oh god, I'm gonna die! Oh god! Oh! Whoa, whoa, gee, how am I supposed to get out of this? Oh no, oh god. Now puzzles are quite difficult to pull off. They need to be hard enough to be actual puzzles, but not too hard and actually interesting. Uncharted gets this right for the most part. If you don't get it right, it just feels like unnecessary filler. Fallen Orders feels like unnecessary filler, but thankfully there aren't that many of them. In fact, Fallen Order's problems aren't really that much of an issue because most of the game is combat, which is the best part. So every problem up to this point is quite minor in the grand scheme of things. Except for this next part.
He's overly critical. He never listens.
Lots of people really like the story in this game, which is fine. Good for you. You enjoy your Star Wars, you weirdos. Some people think the story is great. So let me explain to you why you're so right. I mean, I don't agree with you. Let me start by saying this story is not badly written or performed. This is not a Ubisoft game. There is an actual attempt here. Cameron Monaghan is pretty good, who most notably played the Joker in Gotham.
Well, I'm the Joker, baby.
Deborah Wilson is great, and Forrest Whitaker is... well, he's Forrest Whitaker.
Save the rebellion! Save the dream!
The dialogue here isn't bad, it's just that the plot and the characters suck. But first, let's talk about the new Colossus effect. Wolfenstein 2 had a very mixed reception when it came out. Lots of people thought it was good, lots of people like me thought it was bad. Through many hours of thinking about it, I figured out why some people thought the story was good. Wolfenstein 2's cutscenes have a lot of charm, they're incredibly well made, the performances are excellent and the cinematography makes it very fun to watch. But that don't make it good! David Cage does this all the time. The scenes are incredibly well presented and that tricks a lot of people into thinking it's actually good. When you observe the actual writing, you can poke so many holes in it. The thing with Jedi Fallen Order though is that in addition to this, it also has its own effect. The f***ing Star Wars effect! People love Star Wars, and people are often blinded by it. Rogue One is not a good movie. The only parts you remember were all the action scenes. Don't believe me? What's this guy's name? Go on, I'll wait. It's Cassian Andor. I didn't know that. I just had to look that up while making this video. You know he's getting a prequel? I didn't. I only found that out because I looked it up! I feel like Fallen Order shares these two effects. I'm not going to spoil the plot, but I'll give you a brief overview. You play as a Padawan who is hiding from the Empire after the events of Order 66, which was where all the Jedi were massacred. Bunch of stuff happens, you meet some people and go off on a magical adventure to locate a holocron that has the names of Force-sensitive children on it. Now, the opening of Fallen Order is actually really solid. It generally felt like I was playing an Uncharted game. The game feels like it's going to take its time and slowly introduce the world and the characters, but the intro was over in 40 minutes and then the game dumps you on a planet. Fallen Order suffers from what a lot of stories suffer from, which is where the writer expects you to care. These characters never feel developed because we never really see any development at all. All their struggles and hardships, who they are, what they've done, is just told to you. Cal, the main character, is nothing more than a yes man. The game thinks it's given him a character arc, but he doesn't really learn anything. He feels like exactly the same character from the start of the game to the end of it. He's supposed to build this friendship with Cere and Grease, but they sit on the ship and do nothing for the entire game. And because the dialogue lacks any kind of subtlety, all of the emotional moments feel incredibly forced. This also makes it so any twist this game tries to throw at you, I saw it coming from a mile away. Hell, Cere's whole character only exists to move the plot forward. Grease, who is supposed to be the comedy relief, ends up being the most relatable character because all he wants to do is gamble and look after his ship. He doesn't force his past down your throat and expect you to care. The story tries to do the whole get back on your feet thing multiple times, but once again, it doesn't feel real. Characters swap their motives almost immediately after only a couple lines of dialogue are thrown at them. Basically, we don't see anyone here grow or get a good idea of who they are. It's all told through obvious exposition. You remember Uncharted? Nathan and Sully don't get a backstory to how they met until the third game, yet by the end of the first, their relationship feels real. You get a good sense that they've been together a long time. Nathan makes mistakes, nothing tends to go his way, but you're rooting for him the whole time. There isn't really much tension in Fallen Order, you seem pretty capable of everything. The villains just flat out suck. It's one of those villains that's like, "You can't stop me, I've already activated the bomb." But they don't feel like an actual threat. You know, at the start of a level I park my ship somewhere and run off? Just drive by and blow it up, it's that simple. Also, why did somebody create a holocron with the names of Force-sensitive children in a time where the Empire are hunting down Jedi? Maybe you should take care of the Empire before trying to rebuild the Jedi Order. Well, at least they didn't do something stupid like Baby Yoda. Hey, wait a minute. Star Wars Jedi Rise of Sales really only has one major issue, and that's its story. Thankfully, Respawn was smart enough to make 90% of the game combat, which is its best aspect. But really, the best way to sum up Star Wars The Last Movie is everything here can be improved. And that's why it's a 7. It's no Uncharted, it's no Dark Souls, but it is a solid Star Wars game that I can't not recommend. And the funniest part about all of this is, since Respawn are the only developer owned by EA that are any good, and the fact that EA owns the Star Wars license, the only people who can make good Star Wars games are Respawn on the planet. And yeah, that's about it. And I can't wait for the new Star Wars movie to be a complete disaster.